Welcome back to Paws Mongolia podcast. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to share something personal. I've always been interested in art, beauty. Even when I was young, I loved painting and anything creative. My daughter also has a background in architecture and design, so architecture has always been a topic that's close to my heart. So, my understanding is that architecture has always reflected the problems that societies considered most important. If you look at the medieval Europe, you see castles and city walls because security was the priority. During the Industrial Revolution, factories, rail stations, and dense housing transformed cities because manufacturing changed the economy. After major earthquakes in Japan, Chile, and other countries, building codes become much stricter because people learned from disasters. Architecture has always evolved in response to changing conditions. I think we are seeing another turning point now. Climate change is certainly one of them, but it is not the only one. Extreme heat, flooding, biodiversity loss, aging populations, limited natural resources, and rapid urbanization are all influencing the way buildings are being designed today. One example is that Singapore, for decades, Singapore has invested heavily in integrating vegetation into its urban environment. Many new buildings don't simply have gardens beside them, they have gardens built into them, and rooftop landscapes become part of the architecture itself. That's interesting because the vegetation isn't there only for appearance. It's becoming part of the city's environmental system. I don't think that's an isolated example. Similar ideas are appearing in many countries, although they look different depending on local conditions. The Netherlands approaches the problem from another direction. Instead of assuming water should always be pushed away as quickly as possible, many Dutch projects accept that water will always be part of the landscape. Some neighborhoods include plazas that temporarily store stormwater after heavy rainfall. Parks become flood basins during storms and public spaces the rest of the time. It's a simple idea, but it represents a major change in philosophy. Rather than trying to eliminate nature, architects and engineers increasingly ask how cities can function with natural systems instead of constantly fighting them. Another project that architects still discuss is the Eastgate Center in Zimbabwe. It's often described as being inspired by termite mounds, although that's a simplification. The building doesn't copy termite mounds directly. Instead, it applies similar principles of natural ventilation and temperature regulation. What I find interesting isn't that a termites inspired building, it's that architects looking beyond architecture for ideas, they looked at biology. That seems to be happening more often now. Researchers study forests to understand cooling, wetlands to understand flood protection, mangrove ecosystems to understand coastal resilience. Nature is increasingly becoming a source of engineering ideas rather than simply something buildings overlook. At the same time, another field has become much more influential in architecture: psychology. Not long ago, architecture was largely discussed in terms of structure, materials, engineering, and cost. Today, environmental psychologists, neuroscientists, and public health researchers are increasingly part of the conversation. Researchers continue to investigate how daylight, noise, view of nature, indoor air quality, and access to green spaces influence stress, mood, concentration, and recovery. A well-designed building doesn't cure illness or eliminate anxiety, but there is a growing evidence that design can support well-being and reduce unnecessary stress. That changes how architects think about hospitals. A hospital isn't only a place where medical treatment happens. It's also an environment where people may spend days or weeks during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. These days, many new healthcare projects now include gardens, more natural daylight, quieter interior, family spaces, and stronger connection to outdoor environments. These decisions aren't only aesthetic, they are increasingly informed by research and healthcare design and environmental psychology. So when I was reading about these projects, I kept coming back to animal shelters. That's an area that doesn't receive nearly as much as attention, even though architecture probably matters there too. But I wonder whether we are entering a period where architects begin asking additional questions. How much does chronic noise affect dogs waiting for adoption? Does access to natural daylight make a difference? Can outdoor courtyards reduce stress? Does the layout influence how animals interact with people who might adopt them? Researchers in animal welfare have been studying stress, enrichment, and behavior for years. Architects are beginning to translate some of that knowledge into design. Instead of seeing a shelter as storage space for homeless animals, some new projects approach it as recovery environment. That changes almost everything: the materials, the lighting, the amount of outdoor space, even the experience of people walking through the building. One thing I found encouraging is that some shelters are also becoming community spaces. They include education rooms, meeting spaces, veterinary clinics, walking trails, and gardens that encourage people to spend time there instead of simply arriving to adopt an animal and leave. That actually creates a different relationship between the shelter and the surrounding community. Another idea that's becoming more common is that buildings are no longer expected to be isolated objects. Increasingly, architects are designing them as part of larger ecological systems. A roof isn't simply a roof anymore. It can collect rainwater, reduce heat, or support vegetation. The boundaries between architecture, landscape architecture, ecology, and engineering are becoming much less distinct than they were a generation ago. One project that illustrates this approach is Copenhagen in Copenhagen, At first glance, it's an industrial facility, but it is also functions as public space and green roof. Infrastructure doesn't necessarily have to be hidden from the public. It can become parts of everyday life instead of being separated from it. Another example comes from Japan, although it's less about one building than an approach to design. Japanese architects such as Kengo Kumo and Shinaguri Ban have spent years exploring how natural materials, daylight, simplicity, and carefully designed spaces influence how people experience a building. At the same time, Japan continues to lead in earthquake-resistant engineering because earthquakes are constant reality. That combination is fascinating. A building has to meet demanding structural requirements while also remaining comfortable, welcoming, and human in scale. These goals doesn't always conflict. Sometimes solving one problem encourages better solutions for another. Climate is also changing the conversation about materials. For decades, steel and concrete dominated modern construction because they allowed architects to build higher and faster. These materials remain essential, but there is a renewed interest in engineered timber, recycled materials, and construction methods that reduce environmental impact without compromising safety. Mass timber buildings, for example, have become increasingly sophisticated, with several countries investing heavily in research to understand where they perform well and where their limitations remain. It's a good reminder that innovation isn't always about investing something completely new. Sometimes it's about looking again at materials that have been used for centuries and asking whether modern technology allows them to be used differently. That tells me the profession itself is changing. The architects of the future may need to understand far more than construction. Another thing is that I don't think we talk about enough is whether architecture has become too specialized. When you look at many of the most interesting projects completed in recent years, they rarely succeed because of one brilliant architect working alone. They succeed because architects are working alongside ecologists, psychologists, engineers, landscape architects, and increasingly local communities. So the building becomes the visible result of many different ways of thinking. Climate is one reason for that collaboration, but it's not the only one. Cities are becoming denser, populations are aging in many countries, extreme weather is affecting insurance costs, infrastructure, and public health. Architects are being asked to solve problems that don't fit neatly into one profession anymore. I found that encouraging because it changes the image of architecture. Instead of seeing architects as people who design impressive buildings, it becomes easier to see them as problem solvers. Sometimes these solutions are highly visible. Sometimes they are almost invisible. Better ventilation, cooler public spaces, buildings that continue to operating after disasters, parks that absorb floodwater instead of allowing streets to flood. For much of the 20th century, there is enormous confidence that technology could solve almost every problem. Today's architects still depend on technology, but many are also looking much more carefully at local knowledge, traditional materials, and natural systems. Planting trees because shade can reduce urban temperatures more effectively than adding more concrete. That idea stayed with me because it applies equally to animal welfare. When people think about improving shelters, it's easy to focus on expensive technology. But many improvements don't depend on advanced equipment. More daylight, outdoor enrichment, calmer meeting spaces for adopters, more trees, better airflow. These aren't necessarily expensive ideas, but together they can change how animals experience the environment. The same thinking also applies to wildlife. Around the world, architects and engineers are designing wildlife crossings over highways, restoring wastelands around cities, and creating buildings that reduce bird collisions. These projects remind us that cities don't exist separately from nature. They are part of larger ecosystems, whether we recognize it or not. That may be one of the quietest changes happening in architecture today. It's becoming less about individual buildings and more about relationships between buildings and landscapes, between people and nature, and perhaps increasingly between human communities and the animals that live alongside them. The future will be certainly bring new challenges, but it also bring new ideas, new possibilities, and remarkable creativity. It will be fascinating to watch how architecture continues to shape and be shaped by the changing world around us. Thank you so much for listening, Paws Mongolia podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and conversation, and I will see you in next episode. Thank you so much for listening, Paws Mongolia podcast. Follow this podcast, write a review, and share it with your friends and family. Together, we can grow this podcast and bring more awareness and compassion into the world.